All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into some pretty big changes potentially happening over in Europe,
Yeah,
specifically Germany.
right.
And, Germany's kind of at a crossroads in terms of their global role.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so we've got this really interesting article here from Reuters, and it features some pretty strong statements from Friedrich Merz.
Oh, yeah,
And he is likely to be the next chancellor of Germany.
that's right.
And it seems like he's kind of hinting at a pretty significant shift in Germany's approach to global affairs and particularly security.
For sure. And I think this article really gets at some of the core issues that are really coming to a head right now in Germany, but also more broadly in Europe, as the war in Ukraine continues to rage on.
Yeah. And, I think one of the most kind of eye-catching things that Merz talks about in this article is this idea of Germany potentially sharing nuclear weapons.
Whoa, yeah. I mean, that's a pretty big statement.
Yeah, I mean, like right off the bat, that's a
It's
huge
huge
departure from kind of their, traditional stance.
Yeah, I mean, you think about Germany's history right after World War II, they really embraced this idea of pacifism,
Right.
and being very cautious about military power.
Yeah.
And so for them to even be considering something like nuclear sharing is a really big deal.
Huge shift.
And I think it could definitely raise some concerns among Germany's neighbors.
I mean, think about it. I mean, some countries are still a little bit, uneasy about German militarism, just given their history.
Absolutely.
But he insists that this wouldn't be about replacing the U.S. nuclear umbrella.
Right.
He'd just be supplementing it.
He's saying, like, look, we still need NATO. We still need the U.S. to protect us.
Right.
But we also need to be thinking about other options.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of debate about whether that distinction really holds up.
Yeah. I mean, like, is that really a difference? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, if you're actively pursuing nuclear sharing, is that not kind of a sign that you're not entirely comfortable with just relying on the U.S.?
It definitely sends a signal that they're not content with the way things are.
Right. And so I think, a big question that a lot of people are going to have is like, what is driving this shift?
Right.
Like, what's going on here? Why is Germany suddenly talking about?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously, the war in Ukraine is a huge factor.
Right.
It's really shaken Europe's sense of security.
Yeah.
And I think there's a growing sense that they need to be more self-reliant when it comes to defense.
It's interesting because I was reading another article that was talking about how, there was a recent EU summit
Right.
where they were talking about boosting defense spending.
Exact.
And it seems like there is this kind of momentum building towards this idea of a stronger European defense.
Yeah, a more independent Europe,
Right.
able to take care of themselves.
Exactly. And so that's definitely part of it. But, we also have to consider the domestic political situation in Germany.
Right.
And, one thing that this article points to is the rise of the far-right AfD party.
Yeah,
And it seems like Merz is also trying to respond to that.
absolutely.
So, we're seeing here Merz kind of pandering to the far right.
Well, it's hard to say. I think he's definitely trying to appeal to some of those voters.
Right.
The AfD's rise is tied to anxieties about immigration and Germany's role in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so by taking a tougher stance on defense and even on migration, Merz is trying to sort of address those concerns.
So he's trying to thread this needle.
Yeah, he's trying to walk a tightrope.
Between, appealing to those voters.
Yeah.
But also responding to legitimate security concerns.
Exactly.
It's a really tricky situation.
Yeah.
And then, we look at his stance on migration specifically.
Right.
He's saying he wants to tighten Germany's migration laws.
Yeah.
But he also wants to adhere to broader EU regulations.
Mm.
And that kind of makes me wonder, is that even possible? Can he do both of those things?
Well, it's tough, right?
Yeah.
The EU is kind of like a team, right?
Yeah.
Each country has its own strengths.
Yeah.
But they're supposed to work together. And so if one player wants to change the game plan, it can create tension.
Absolutely.
He's got to figure out how to address those domestic concerns about immigration,
Right.
while also maintaining solidarity with the EU.
And, another layer of complexity here is that Merz is trying to form a coalition government.
Right.
And to do that, he needs the support of the Green Party.
The Greens.
And they have a very different outlook.
Yeah, the Greens are really interesting because they're the environmentalists in Germany.
Right.
They have a lot of influence on spending,
Right.
and they're very concerned about, these big packages that Merz is proposing, especially the defense spending.
Yep.
They want to make sure that that money is used responsibly,
Right.
that it's not just fueling an arms race.
So they want some guarantees.
They want some control.
Yeah, like, okay, if we're going to sign off on this, we need to know that you're going to be careful with this money.
Exactly.
And so, it's really interesting to think about how this is all going to play out.
Yeah.
I mean, if his Mercefield pulls this off,
Right.
could this lead to like a more independent,
It's possible.
a more assertive European defense posture?
It could really push the EU towards greater self-reliance when it comes to security.
And potentially even, lessen their dependence on the U.S.
Potentially. Yeah.
Wow.
It's a big question.
Yeah. But then, on the flip side of that,
Right.
couldn't that also potentially increase tensions with Russia?
Oh, absolutely.
If you have a more assertive Germany,
Right.
especially one that's potentially sharing nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Russia might see that as a threat.
Yeah, like, hey, what are you guys doing over there? What are you up to?
It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And I think there's some very real consequences
Yeah, no kidding.
that could come out of this.
So there's just so much to unpack here.
Yeah. There is.
This potential shift in Germany's global role, the impact on European security.
Right.
And then, just the ripple effects on the global stage.
It's a lot.
It's huge.
Yeah.
It really is. And I think this is something that we're going to have to keep a very close eye on.
Oh, absolutely. This is a fascinating moment in European politics.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this all unfolds.
Yeah. It's like we're witnessing history in the making.
Maybe.
We'll
see.
We'll see. But it's definitely something worth paying attention to.
For sure.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll wrap things up here.
Okay.
But this is a conversation that we're going to continue to follow.
Absolutely.
So stay tuned for more deep dives into the world of global affairs.
Sounds good.
All right.
Take care.
You too.